Thank you very much for coming. I am the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. My name is Paul Carey. We have a door prize for anyone who can say the name of the school 3 times quickly, or you get extra cookies, something like that. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership is delighted to be hosting the inaugural lecture of the, let's say, refounded Center for the Study of Economic Liberty under its new director, Dr. Ross Emmett. So the inaugural lecture, and it's fitting that the inaugural speaker of this inaugural lecture series is the new director, Ross Emmett. Let me explain a little bit about the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, the relationship between this center and the other center, and then I will turn to introducing Dr. Emmett. The Center for the Study of Economic Liberty is now a joint project between this new school in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the W.P. Carey School of Business. The school is committed in its curriculum and its broader experiences for students, and in our public outreach efforts, speaker series like this, we are committed to reconnecting liberal education and civic education to prepare young men and women to think about leadership and service in civil society and in public affairs. Outside is a barrage of flyers and information, squishy toys, other things to remind you of all the things the school does. One of the students was just mentioning we have our own speaker series this year on the theme of polarization and civil disagreement. And the first event in that series is September 11th. Jonah Goldberg of National Review. The following week, we have another kind of speaker event. Each year we have a Constitution Day lecture. So we have Richard Brookhiser coming to talk about Lincoln and the American founders, and that's September 17th. So the year will be off and running from that point. So please, for students especially, sign up, give us your email address, get information about the courses in the school. We have a major and a minor, and also information about these different events. 2 research centers were, in a way, the founding inspiration for this new school, new department at ASU. One is the Center for Political Thought and Leadership, which began in the history faculty within Shippers, that department, History, Philosophy, Religious Studies. This summer, it transitioned over to Skettle. Our new associate director of the school is also the new associate director for that center, and then we'll be doing a search for a full director for the center. And this is the other center, Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, and we are delighted that we were able to lure Professor Emmett away from James Madison College at Michigan State University. Ross actually showed up in February, right? And has been hard at work, and for those of you who are involved in the research seminar and other activities that Ross had already begun this summer, you know that there's sort of a new energy and new activity for the center. So we all look forward to seeing what Ross is going to be doing in the years ahead. He is a full professor in our school and then has an affiliate appointment in the economics department in the Carey School. Just to briefly introduce Ross without doing him justice, he is probably the leading scholar on Frank Knight in particular, and maybe more broadly on the Chicago School of Economic Thought, and then on other topics related to Knight and the Chicago School, for example, John Maynard Keynes' relationship to those thinkers and that way of thinking. For a decade, he was the editor of Research in the History of Economic Thought and Methodology. His broader scholarship and also the kinds of courses he'll be teaching in Skettle could be broadly described as history of economic thought from Smith and Malthus to the 20th century, the rise of markets and the idea of an economics of ordered liberty, but also religion and economic thought as one of his areas of specialty. So as I mentioned, he has an extensive new research agenda in mind for the center, and he already has a whole speaker series launched. He reserved for himself the first slot in this speaker series. We're delighted you're here, and please join me in welcoming Ross Emmett to talk on the Constitution of Innovation.
Well, good afternoon, and I'm happy to be here with you. This is the first lecture in a series called Perspectives on Economic Liberty that will be going on throughout this year and presumably longer. There's several themes that I could have chosen to use to launch this inaugural lecture series. As you heard from Dr. Carey, there's almost nothing in the history of economic thought I couldn't talk about. But I chose the topic, the Constitution of Innovation, because it reaches across several of the research areas that I anticipate the center developing over the next few years. And it's a topic that I've been working on myself for a while. I suspect that you are wondering about the juxtapositioning of the two key words in our title today, Constitution and innovation. They don't sound like things that would be normally put together. What do these words have to do with each other? Some of you might have even come wondering, especially the politically minded in the group, if I was going to speak about innovations that could improve our Constitution. I'm not even going to go near that topic, although obviously I have my views. But let me take each word separately, and starting with the word innovation. Aside from saying the creation of cool stuff, I suspect that many of you might agree with this definition. Innovation occurs when people have new ideas about how to use things to create value for others. 3 words are highlighted on the screen because they create a new trinity of economic resources that replace the old classical economics trinity of land, labor, and capital, which economists still tend to dominantly use today to think about economic life. But one could argue that we have moved away from land, labor, and capital to talk about people, ideas, and things. I like this definition. I first heard it from David Warsh in his book, Knowledge and the Wealth of Nations. And I started using it. In fact, I even recorded with one of my classes on the same kind of topic I'm teaching here, a 10-part lecture series entitled The Constitution of Innovation. And the entire thing was organized around this definition of innovation. And then I started to be wondering if perhaps it was complete and if it might not need something else. The catch is in the other word in the definition, value. How do you know that an innovation has value for others? Okay. What's the test? Well, there's a tendency here to rely on expertise. After all, at a university, surely the experts can identify what new inventions will bring real innovation. Or shouldn't established firms in an industry know what might work? So we often say, well, the experts will know what innovations are. Unfortunately, I can give you story after story. I started to write those out and realized I could spend the entire lecture on that topic, so I better summarize quickly. Where expertise seriously misread a new product or service's potential improvement. Knowing what has worked is not relevant once an innovation changes the parameters of the industry or the situation. Perhaps I couldn't resist one story. So perhaps the best recent example are the venture capitalists who turned down the opportunity to fund Airbnb. All of them, every single one of them, turned down the opportunity to fund Airbnb because, quite simply, they could not imagine that people would home share. And then even Airbnb itself didn't realize how many apartment complexes and hotels would in their entirety end up becoming devoted to Airbnb. Okay. Assuming expertise or experience in the industry, etc., is the best guide to the future is not a safe bet. The venture capitalist mistake reflects, at least in part, a tendency that we have in our thinking about innovation to focus on invention, especially innovations or inventions we consider significant. And Airbnb and Uber have constantly in the last several years been considered irrelevant innovations by people who think of innovation as invention. It's got to be something different than that. This is not life transforming, right? It's not life transforming like, say, Elon Musk's Tesla or his SpaceX programs, which could radically change humanity's future, right? This is true invention. This is true innovation. And furthermore, these things are receive millions in public funding, right? Because they've been able to convince us that these innovations, these inventions, are in the national or the public interest. Now, the notion that innovation is tied to national interest or national good has a long history. Before the Civil War, a Scotsman by the name of John Ray traveled from his homeland to Montreal, and then on to New York. And eventually he made his way through Central America, and then up into the California territories, and then all the way to Hawaii, where he worked as a doctor and died. In 1834, while he was living in New York City, John Ray published a book called A Statement on Some New Principles on the Subject of Political Economy, in which he defended the argument that innovation must serve the public interest. Invention, he said, is the only power on earth that can be said to create new wealth. Trade, by the way, he's wrong about this, but so all of this, but trade, he claimed, was mostly just reciprocal exchange of wealth. I buy wealth from you, you get wealth from me, it's just the same thing, right? So it's only invention that creates new wealth. Trade just shifts the wealth around. Okay? Wealth, and in particular what he called national capital, that is the stock of wealth that was available to improve a nation's wealth, was increased by invention. The importance of invention as wealth creation, Ray argued, meant that nations could not turn a blind eye to invention. His book urged legislators, that was his word for anybody in governance, whom he saw as the agents of the nation, to direct part of the energies of the community towards the furtherance of this power of invention. In effect, Ray urged legislators to see themselves as the drivers of innovation, and hence to take responsibility for strategies that would ensure innovation was directed towards national goals. And these are actually, aside from saying scientific research funding, these are actually all almost straight out of Ray's text. And yet, these are strategies that are employed today by nations around the world as part of their national innovation strategies or their public investments, whether they have a strategic vision or not, the public investments that they make. Again, whole lectures, but not at the time. Okay. This is all well and may be good, but as I said before, the problem lies in the word value. And I'm sure that depending upon technocrats, or maybe worse, politicians, does not provide us with a real guide to what creates value for others. The real test at the end of the day is the market test. Innovations only improve things if people want them, if they fulfill a need or a want a customer has at a price that can be produced and sold. It's in the context of trade or exchange that improvements are revealed. This lets me, This lets me adopt a shorthand expression for innovation, and this is not an overthrowing of my earlier definition, okay, but it simply cuts through having to do all that stuff because any trade-tested improvement is an innovation. Someone is better off. So trade-tested improvement is my shorthand for innovation. And in my discussions with Deirdre McCloskey, who wrote that trilogy of books, each of those books is about 600 pages long. So those of you who want a semester-long reading project, go for it. I have read all of them. I've read some of them more than once. Deirdre's a friend. We were at a meeting together talking about the manuscript of her third book on bourgeois equality, and we argued about this, and I held out for the earlier definition, and she was holding out for market-tested improvements, and she wins. Partly because of the quote that's on the screen, of course. Right? Sheer innovation without the trade test is worse than useless. You won't be surprised that for both me and Deirdre, the inspiration for using trade-tested improvements is a source that's even older than John Ray's. In fact, Ray's book was an attack on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. If you could have read the subtitle, the small print underneath the title on his front page, it basically said, I want nothing to do with Adam Smith. Okay? That's not what it actually said, but it summarizes fairly succinctly. Smith's Wealth of Nations is the ur-text for thinking about innovation as emerging from exchange and trade. Smith's optimism about what exchange and markets can do for nations was built on the assumption that improvement occurred through the test of trade. The standard formulation of Smith's contribution, this is my summary of what people usually say about Smith. Trade enables the division of labor, which enhances specialization and thereby generates an expansion of production at lower costs, which then in turn raises real incomes. Okay? That doesn't sound like it's much about innovation, frankly. It's about specialization and interdependence, words that are common in economics discourse all the time. But anybody who reads Smith's text, The Wealth of Nations, okay, cannot walk away from it without realizing that he's talking about how trade and market interaction enhances people's lives through innovation and trade-tested improvements. I wish I had time. I had some of these written, and then as I realized how long it was going, I had to cut them all out. I wish I had time to read some of Smith to you, because his text is full of his awareness of the wisdom of ordinary people, not experts, the wisdom of ordinary people. The foibles and follies of elites, the schemes and wicked rent-seeking behavior of merchants. Anyone who thinks that Adam Smith is a fan of capitalists needs to know that there's not a single passage in The Wealth of Nations in which a businessman is portrayed in a positive light. Okay? They are never portrayed positively. Okay? And yet, he's extolling a world in which they have to compete with each other. Okay? And so this is summarizing let me give you back to the first part of the sentence so you remember where I am. Smith's awareness of stuff, right? And in particular, the undesigned beauty and prosperity that emerges from people talking and trading. Talking and trading. The ordinary business of life. Okay? Alfred Marshall defined economics as the ordinary business of life. Okay? And for Smith, talking and trading is the ordinary business of life. But there's one quote that I have to use from Smith because it's needed for purposes later. So here it is. One of the most, if not the most, frequently quoted passage in Adam Smith's work. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, or the brewer, the brewer and the baker, got reversed, that we should expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. This is used as the the way of defining that Smith says we're all selfish. Never mind the fact that he wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he says, the first sentence of the book says, howsoever selfish humans may be, there's something in our nature that makes us interested in the affairs of others. Okay, well, yeah, we won't read that book, okay? So I can understand how somebody thinks this is a classic statement of selfishness. But most commentators here have forgotten that Smith is talking about an exchange. And there are two sides to any market exchange. Just so you know, from Smith's house directly across the street was the bakery lane. He lived right next door to one of the largest breweries. And he was just down the street from what at that time was called the Fleisch Market, the butcher, where they cut off, off the hides of the big carcasses of the beef and other things. So these are his neighbors, the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. And this is where he lives, right? And he's constantly engaged in exchange. Both sides of the exchange have an interest. So let me pause a moment and turn this paragraph around. This is my version. It's an additional paragraph. I wish he had put it in. It's also not from my benevolence that the butcher, the baker, or the brewer can expect their dinner, but from my regard to my own interest. If this is the case, if both sides of an exchange are self-interested, how can there be an exchange? Well, that's because in order for me to achieve my interest, I have to give or provide the butcher, the baker, the brewer with something that's of interest to them. And if they want to get, their income, they have to give me something that's of interest to me. So in fact, self-interested behavior, and by the way, I will never say that Smith believes that people are selfish, because he doesn't believe that people are selfish, but he does believe that they are self-interest. They have an interest that they take upon themselves. That's different than being selfish. Set in the context of market exchange, self-interested behavior becomes other regarding behavior. I'm not willing quite to say other interested. I'm saying I'm willing to say other regarding behavior. That is, I have to regard your interest. I have to think about your interest in order for me to sell you something that you will, right? If I'm completely unsuccessful in this lecture, right, and 3 years from now, Paul Carey notices that Ross Emmett has taught 0 students, right, for 3 years, right, the university is going to start talking to me about what I'm doing. Right? So I have to think about what will communicate to you, and you want me to do that, but you have to figure out a way to help me too, right? Consumer choices become part of the process of market-tested improvement. Exchange is always, if exchange and not coercion, other regarding, even though it is also self-interested. One curious thing about Smith's discussion of markets, I've already done that, never mind. That was the thing about the business people being selfish. I will close with this comment about that, though. When Smith talks about business people, for example, being selfish, the point that he's trying to make is not that business people are selfish and everybody else is great. The point he's trying to make is that when they get together in the bar or Starbucks and realize that if they pass a piece of legislation, they could get some benefit. And this is one of the examples he uses, meeting in the tea house, and they start scheming against the public. What they're scheming against the public to do is to write a piece of legislation that will give the business people some advantage against consumers, or keep other business people out, like some occupational licensing, right, that will keep people out of their business. Okay? The point that Smith is making is that non-market processes do reward selfish behavior, but market processes will penalize it, because selfish behavior has to become other-regarding in order to be successful. Well, that was a whole lot about exchange and innovation. Let's talk about constitutions. The other word in our title is similarly fraught with definitional difficulty. When Americans hear the word constitution, right, I put we the people up there, and you guys are just like, yeah, constitution, right? They think about the preamble of a founding political document. But of course, it's not the document that's the Constitution of the United States. Okay? The document is a description of the Constitution, the composition of our national government. It defines it, it tells us what it is, and it helps us understand it, it creates it. Many of you know that Alexander Hamilton opened his defense of the Constitution by saying that it seemed to have been left to the United States to decide the important question whether societies are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Federalist 1, right? But the opposite of force need not only be choice. And upon reflection, we may realize that in the words of Adam Ferguson, a friend of Adam Smith's, that nations might stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. That is, people may figure out how to live together without having to write a constitution publicly ahead of time. In fact, many of you know that the U.S. Constitution is the first written constitution in the world. And that there are several countries that still don't have written constitutions. What's one of the ones that doesn't? Right. The United Kingdom. And actually, I think I might have to break that, because I think Scotland's is now written. So it's only England. Okay. Also Israel. Okay. Also, it's only 3. The first 2 should point you towards the 3rd. New Zealand. Okay. Canada only got its constitution in 1982, okay. And really it's simply a part of the British law. And when I had my students write about it, they came to me and said, "There's nothing in this constitution that describes how Parliament is structured." I was like, yeah, because Parliament's Parliament. Everybody knows how Parliament's structured. That's not what the Constitution's about. It's not about, how it's going to work. Well, what is it about? Okay. Ferguson's conception, by the way, Ferguson wrote these words about 5 years before Hamilton put pen to paper and became Publius. Those of you who know what Publius is, you'll understand the reference. Ferguson's conception of a constitution is more compatible with the metaphor of an ecosystem whose composition, that is, its constitution, reflects the actions of the ecosystem's inhabitants within the complex relationship of the various systems which comprise it. Certainly, the ecosystem of innovation is a common enough expression, and one I've heard a lot around ASU. And yet, as we're going to see, once again, I have questions. Because the design of an innovation ecosystem is a big business itself, sometimes we end up with centralized systems. Right? Like this on the left, well, your left, yeah. the one which has only a single central point. Okay? They look more, and sometimes innovation ecosystems look more like hierarchies than they do like markets, decentralized. Markets and Hierarchies was the title of the book that launched Oliver Williamson's Nobel Prize, which he shared with Elinor Ostrom. Should we be concerned if ecosystems of innovation end up sounding more like hierarchies than like markets or organic suggestions? So the question, and the blockchain might look like a organic ecosystem of innovation. Although it's interesting to see how some of the parts of the blockchain have started to become increasingly centralized. So there's always this tension here in thinking about these sort of organic perspectives on social and economic organization. Yeah. So the question that's driving my thinking here is the question: what would a Smithian, Adam Smith, trade-based conception of the constitution of innovation look like? And it's a question we haven't really answered yet. One possible answer is this one. Friedrich Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. Hayek's book begins by arguing that the Constitution of that the Constitution of Liberty is what has given us innovation and prosperity. So he defends his Constitution of Liberty with a innovation, prosperity-oriented defense. Unfortunately, he never kind of hooks back and explains the connections. So one of my problems with Hayek's book, and this is my favorite of Hayek's books, I'm actually not a huge Hayek fan. That's because I study the guy who kept arguing with him. Okay? So I'm always arguing with him the way Frank Knight would have argued with him. Okay? Hayek always said, I never understood why the guy didn't like me. Okay? And so, yeah. But this book has a richer conception of constitution that I think is a one source that we can turn to. And intriguingly, there's a lot of people who don't like this. This is, from their point of view, the worst of Hayek's books, because he does things like argue that there might need to be a social safety net of some kind to help people when their entrepreneurial ventures fail. So, and that alarms some people. Another source comes from the work of Vincent and Elinor Ostrom, who I mentioned before, and their principles of analysis for the robustness of various commons governance systems. Unfortunately, Lynn Ostrom died shortly after she won the Nobel. I believe she was actually considering a move, if not already agreeing to a move, to Arizona State University before her diagnosis. And she had 2 years after she was diagnosed and wrapped up all her research programs, visited 200 places around the world to wrap up research or solidify research agendas all over the world. But if we think of the Constitution like an ecosystem, one easy transition is to thinking about it as a complex commons, with multiple players, with competing and cooperative interests, as well as various institutions, norms, and rules set among other institutions and commons. And if we think of it that way, there's things we could learn from Ostrom, as well as Hayek and a few others. These are, by the way, are some of the, I think they're all of the design principles that Ostrom has. In the time I have left, I'm going to look briefly at 3 issues that I think arise out of the Hayek-Ostrom tradition that we could think about in talking about a constitution of innovation. And the first one is the, actually we're not going to have anything on the screen for a while. The first one is the importance of small talk in ordinary exchange. I've already kind of mentioned this, but the second one is about economic liberty in a commons setting. And the third one is one of my favorite all-time lectures, which I can't give you the whole thing, but I can give you a taste of, called The Promise of Failure. Okay. So let's talk about small talk. The individual I studied most in my career, Frank Knight, who is a Chicago economics professor and also philosopher, once changed Grisham's law to read, small talk drives out good talk. Grisham's law is bad money drives out good money. Right? Small talk drives out good talk. He believed that democracy was government by discussion and that democratic discussion had to be good talk. That is, it had to be focused on figuring out both what value problems separated us and what solutions we had to offer. If small talk, say, discussing the latest foibles of our president, were to dominate democratic discussion, so much that we didn't deal with our disagreements over values and the real issues facing us, we'd be doomed. Okay? He once responded to a move by Hayek. He and Hayek were having a correspondence about capital theory, and Hayek actually yielded to Knight on an issue, and Knight was like, oh, maybe we're actually like, okay, I'll accommodate to him. And he received the newest journal. And in the newest journal, Hayek said, I just think bold statements of a position are the best way to initiate a conversation. And he just put forward a view that that Hayek himself had already said he didn't agree with, and that was the antithesis of Knight's. So Knight wrote Hayek a letter. And he said, if this is how we behave, then the authorities might as well send us off to the salt mines. This, by the way, was written in the early 1930s, when he and Hayek were both growing increasingly concerned about Nazi Germany. And Knight himself had refused an honorary degree from Heidelberg University because he told them point blank, I'm not coming to your country because you're doing terrible things to people. Well, Lynn Ostrom disagrees with Knight. She argued that the time two farmers take talking over their fence line about the weather and the state of their cows, or the time families spend together at church dinners, school socials, dinners together, was essential to their being able to work together well when the need arose to deal with a dispute, like new rules for a water system or protecting themselves against wildlife that would threaten their stock. Small talk, ordinary conversation, was essential to Lynn's understanding of how commons thrived. She believed that commons required a sort of underneath set of just ordinary actions by people to be able to actually coordinate. Hayek had a similar concern about expertise. He believed that the informal rules and norms of a society played an important role in the social cohesion that enabled market exchange to flow smoothly. His conception of social interaction as a vast network of exchange led him to ponder if human intelligence itself at the individual level was essentially networks. And you're like, isn't it? Right? Well, at the time, psychologists argued that the human brain was a centralized processing unit, and that there was a part of the brain that ran everything, and everything else was controlled by, it was a hierarchy. He wrote a book in response called The Sensory Order, little book about human psychology. In that book, he argues that the brain is neural networks. Psychologists were astonished to discover 30 years later that an economic philosopher back in the late 50s had actually discovered how the brain worked. At his point, it was just speculation. With both Hayek and Ostrom, then, we have accounts of exchange, discussion, and other forms of human interchange that focus on the ordinariness of common activity and how they end up leading to societal level coordination with little need for centralized top-down control. Both of them argue that the closer we come to creating an institutional setting in which human action rather than human design can end up addressing most of our problems, the better off we'll be. In innovation terms, what we often forget is that most innovations are really small stuff. SpaceX is not the most important innovation going on in the world today, right? Lots and lots of innovation is small scale. It's done to reduce transaction costs. It's done by consumers, not producers. Consumers in the way in which they use products that they consume, and then those feed back into the market, and the market responds by saying, oh, if you're going to do it that way, yeah, sure, I'll help you out. Right? Let me figure out a way to do this. Okay. I could give you an example from the selling and buying of books, but it would be relevant to about 4 or 5 people in this room, so I won't. But it's certainly one that is interesting. And of course, it reflects, right, what happens when that feedback ends up leading to large changes in markets, like the entrance of Amazon into the book trade, right? Today, almost all trade in books is intermediated by Amazon. Okay? And that's fundamentally changed the world, but it happened, even though it ended up being centralized, it happened through exchange and activity that was very decentralized. Similar transaction moves have created what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction across all kinds of markets. Here's what Schumpeter said. This was written, Peter, do you know the year? I don't know the year. 50 something?
No, 42.
42? So the earlier part of the 40s. Yeah, okay. So this was written in the early 40s. He says, in capitalist reality as distinguished from his textbook picture, it's not ordinary price and quantity competition which counts, but the competition from a new commodity, from a new technology, a new source of supply. Ooh, that was interesting. A new type of organization. Competition which commands a decisive cost or quality advantage and which strikes not at the margin of the profits, but at the foundations and at the very life of the business or the industry. This process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. He calls it in another passage the perennial gale of creative destruction. Okay? This kind of creative destruction is right now transforming industries. Right? In the last year, we had massive closures of retail stores. Toys R Us, Sears, Chipotle, H&R Block, J. Crew. Okay? All of them if closed entirely or closed many of their outlets. You can go check the list and you'll find way more examples that are relevant to your lives. And the list goes on. Right? What has changed? Okay? Online shopping. Yes, mediated by, in the first place, Amazon, but also by many others. And those are going to be upturned as well. The innovations that I would argue, the innovations that are most shaping our lives are not going to be autonomous autos and space travel, but simpler things that make our ordinary transactions easier, more numerous, and reach further across the globe. Several people argue that the greatest invention of the 20th century was the shipping container. Okay? Because it radically lowered costs of the transportation of goods and also their storage and their transportation to where, so everything can happen in one space and it's not constantly being offloaded, unloaded, put out, And that's one of the kinds of arguments I'm pointing at. Second topic, economic liberty in a common setting. Adam Smith argued that the wealth of nations flourished best when our activity was coordinated by a system of natural liberty. The best way to understand natural in Smith's context is to remember Adam Ferguson's line about social outcomes being the result of human action rather than the execution of some human design. That's natural for Smith. My conjecture is that a robust system of natural liberty is similar to a robust commons in Lynn Ostrom's definition of a commons governance that's robust. Now, most of us think of these two settings as dramatically different. Most of us think of commons as being things like fisheries or pastures, and we know that they don't work and that they require government oversight. Of course, what Lynn Ostrom said was that there are opportunities for social cooperation. And in societies all through history and today, commons become means by which people cooperate together. Not perfectly, but markets aren't perfect either. Markets aren't perfect. Government's not perfect. Commons aren't perfect. But we can start talking about how they connect and their interactions. Third topic, the promise, and this is the last one, the promise of failure. I said this in class the other day and got a couple of looks from people like, so I'll say it again here. The reality of the constitution of innovation is that every entrepreneur will ultimately fail. Every industry will ultimately disappear. And every innovation will ultimately be replaced. The perennial, perpetual gale of creative destruction. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it could be exhilarating. You could be frightened by it. Why should I bother being an entrepreneur? I'm just going to fail. You can change the world in the meantime. Like, think about it. For Jeff Bezos, you know who he is? Yeah, everybody knows Jeff Bezos, founder of Apple. Sorry, of the other A, Amazon. I'm going to mention the other Apple, the other A, Apple, in a second. For Jeff Bezos, it means that he's going to end up like Henry Ford and Steve Jobs. Names of former industry destroyers who have now or will soon be disappearing into the books of industrial history. Their names, or the names they gave their innovations, may remain on products, but their continued relevance to shaping the future is gone. But for you, the promise of failure may be exhilarating. Like, so much more is open to you than was open to my generation. So many more possibilities exist. But it can all disappear and grind to a halt. The constitution of innovation we have today is under threat. It's robust, and there are many features of that robustness that have been tested. But there are also fragilities in any system, and the constitution of innovation is potentially fragile as well. My greatest concern is that those creating the threats don't realize that those who will be hurt are not the titans of industry or professors like me in sun-baked halls, but rather those who can be excluded from the commons by the constitution of innovation, those who will be prevented from participating in innovation or will be denied its fruits. I'm going to conclude the following way. Two of the research programs we're launching at the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty seek to help us understand both the institutional, regulatory frameworks of a society that engenders innovation and entrepreneurship, and also the robustness of the institutional frameworks that allow such entrepreneurial and innovative commons to exist. You will, over the next year, begin to hear news of the development of a Doing Business North America report. there's some information on the table out there about a one-pager about the Doing Business North America report that's going to provide objective measurement of the business regulatory frameworks within which businesses in the states, provinces, and North American territories of Canada, the U.S., and Mexico operate. The DBNA report will provide access to researchers and policymakers interested in using the report's data for research and policy purposes. The report will provide the opportunity to expand dramatically the kinds of studies that my colleague Steve Slavinsky here has been doing and has created about things like occupational licensing. He's worked on how occupational licensing affects immigrant entrepreneurship and also the entrepreneurial opportunities for those who have served jail time. We hope over the next year to add even more resources to the center that can expand our entrepreneurship-oriented research. I'll also be working over the next year to begin a research project with Ostrom-related researchers here at Arizona State and elsewhere to conduct research that will expand our appreciation for the robustness of her design principles for commons governance, with a plan to pursue external funding in the next couple years. Both of these projects are at their root, explorations that emerge from consideration of the constitution of innovation. Thank you. I welcome your comments and questions and criticisms. Yes. Actually, let me give preference to students, if you don't mind. Go.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to speak. And we'll wait.
Wait.
Okay. Hello.
There you
that
go.
was awkward.
You're
Hello. Thank you very much for your speech and for beginning the lecture series. My name is Ilana, and I'm a student with Skettle. And my question is actually one of the first slides that you had. You mentioned that innovation without the trade test is worse than useless, and I wanted to know why it was worse.
That's Deirdre. Maybe in her over-exuberance to make a point. But I think her point was that without the test of trade, we will expend massive amounts of resources on things that ultimately do not actually provide value for real human beings. They may for politicians, they may for, I don't know, university professors, who are partly real human beings. They may, but she basically sees it as a waste of. And so you can think of it this way. When do you know how to stop innovating? That sounds weird, right? You should always be innovating. But if the cost is too high, if you're not actually giving people value, you should go do something else. Take a break for a while. Nobody's buying your stuff? Okay, I thought that was going to be wonderful, but maybe I better stop and go do something else for a while. And, you know, in the labor force, you get a very clear signal of the value you're contributing. You get paid a wage. Okay? And as long as you're doing your job and you're getting paid a wage, you're contributing to the economy. So her argument is if you're being misguided, if misguided policy or misguided rules keep you trying to innovate and spending billions of dollars doing it, or even a few $100s doing it, and there's no positive market response, and you've done everything you can do, she would encourage you to keep trying. And it's not that she would say, give up on the first try. She would say, try something else a little bit. Let's see what you could do. But at some point, you stop. And I know Edison didn't do that, right? He has that famous line about, what you've tried, I don't remember what the number was. Anybody remember what the number was? 10,000. You've tried 10,000 ways to make a light bulb. He says, well, that just means I need to try, 10,001 ways, right? Okay. But Deirdre's point is simply, there are many ways to contribute value to society. Innovation is only one of them. And if what you're doing is misguided or directed to ways that actually are only rent-seeking for one group of people, maybe you really should be doing something else. And those resources should be expended somewhere else. I had a student.
Thank you very
I'll let
much.
it pass over to you next.
Okay. Do you mean the innovation is market-oriented?
No, yes and no.
Or do you mean it's useless if we do research as, if we regard our research as innovations?
So I want to be careful I say this clearly. We don't know if a invention, an introduced change, etc., is having a positive result until it goes, as you said, to the market, until it faces the test of trade. Now, there are settings in which we don't have a market. We have government programming which funds, I'll use, say, military equipment. So you may come up with well, in that case, even there, it's going to end up in the market because the firm's going to end up producing it and they're going to make a profit from it. But in the old days, we would have talked about the space program, but we won't do that now. So the key question is, how do you, so you could say, this is a faster way of doing X. But when we translate it into an actual market product, it may cost too much. Somebody else may do it faster. It may actually not require that level of technical expertise. So you won't know that until you face the test of trade. I think he wants to respond back.
Yeah, your response recall me as the Tesla Model S. Yeah, it used to be cost expensive, since it's very hard for them to find a way to reduce the cost.
Yeah.
But nowadays it seems, boom, it find a way to reduce the cost, and now it's very popular. And and the stock market of things is
And that's and he had the resources, and I will point out that the government kept him alive for a long time because of public purpose, that they wanted the energy sources to work. So he's, I can't remember, does somebody remember the number for how much I'm paying for every Tesla that's produced? I know with GMC volts, for every volt that entered the market, taxpayers were paying $250,000 per car. So if you bought a GMC Volt at the beginning, you were actually getting a $250 subsidy from the government to buy that car, and I was paying, and all the other people in the room were paying. Right? So at what point is that really innovation? It is innovation, and yet, can it actually stand on its own in the market? For example, Toyota did all of their innovation with Prius, and I'm not trying to promote Prius over Volt, okay, this is not, without any government intervention at all. It was entirely Toyota funded. Now, Toyota has a lot of money, and they have some preferential agreements with Japan's government that maybe modify slightly what I'm saying, but only slightly. And Jeff Bezos' development of Amazon is done largely without government support of the company itself.
So the market can be the only criterion or the measurement to judge if the innovation is valuable or not.
Ultimately.
Okay.
Like, I mean, you can say I can do this faster.
Since I feel that sometimes maybe the market or the investors should be generous, or maybe open-minded to give him or his researchers more time to show the value of the
Right.
innovation.
And I realize that one of the difficulties here is that especially investors in the market, see, remember I said I don't necessarily trust expertise? Well, venture capitalists, investors, angel funds, etc., they view themselves as experts in a space. And they're not always right. And so if you're like, you're wrong, then stick with it. But at some point, you're going to have to face the market test, right? So I'm not saying like now, but like at some point, it's going to come down to, does it work in the market or not? Go ahead.
So I'm Dale Johnson.
Yeah, Dale.
A great example of Deirdre's theory is Iridium satellite telephone system, funded by a private company, Motorola, here in Phoenix. A lot of the development occurred here, so you should look that case study up. I want to ask you a question. What's the greatest threat to the constitution of innovation?
I don't know if I have an answer yet. Yeah, try.
Can I follow up?
Yeah. Sorry, Trevor.
Um,
Canadians
would-
always take a back seat
I-
so pleasantly.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Would one threat be evident in the recent polling suggesting that the younger generation in America is not so fond of markets or capitalism? The phrase was not Constitution of Innovation, but it might be a little too clever to say it, but is there a market test that market economics is failing with certain part of the population, youth, that there's some temptation to think you could be better off if you had an emphasis on redistribution, socialism or social democracy, something like that. Is that a threat?
Yeah.
Is it a threat that suggests some weakness about the theory?
I think I'll go two different directions in responding to that. One, it's striking the difference between the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s in terms of the rate of people starting businesses. We have almost entirely ceased being entrepreneurial. And one of the reasons for that, Steve will kick in if he wants to, is the massive rise in occupational licensing and the difficulty of entering ordinary occupations that many people have used over the years as an entry point into personal entrance into the market and the kind of freedom that the young people you're referring to are seeking. Because what they see is the only points of entry are you have to go to law school, you have to go to a big business, there's such little opportunity just to do something. You can't get, in the state of Michigan, kids in high school are only allowed to work during the school year 10 hours a week. So how do you get experience in jobs? How do you create an environment in which someone knows what it means to buy and sell in a marketplace? Right, so all these things create, I think they create the kind of environment you're talking about, and they do undermine, right, an entrepreneurial and innovative society. They make it more reliant upon the large-scale activity, but how do we recover that in some ways? That's part of my question. It's a couple different, oh, yeah, okay, here and then Trevor.
Right,
Students first.
I have a question regarding a concept that's been brought up in one of my classes that is on innovation society, and it's, to quote the professor, he says, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that kind of the existing systems deeply limit and control the paths for innovation. You know, already we've learned about kind of the history of the keyboard as an example of this, the Qwerty Keyboard, which despite the fact that there are better alternatives that have been developed, it has stayed unchanged due to, you know, the market test in and of itself. So is there a way, so how do you think this will affect us in our society, kind of the current existing models and technological systems, and how that will impact future innovation, and if you think it might be possible to reduce the impact of, existing systems in positive innovations? On
Yes
the
and-
ability to
yes and
positively
no.
innovate.
Yes and no. The legacy that you're talking about is going to continue. And so it's going to create an environment that your generation is going to have to deal with. At the same time, I'm really tempted to quote, quote the line, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Okay? Like, the system has many difficulties. And usually, one of those is that it overlooks the actions of ordinary people. And in all of what I've talked about, one of the key ingredients in that is that, when I talk about the market test as well, it's about where do ordinary people encounter and have the opportunity to participate in moving their lives and the lives of those around them forward within market settings. So I can't give you a here's 3 things that that are for sure signs that this is breaking down. No. Okay? And I also realized that one of the things that happens, you used the Qwerty Keyboard as an example, and it's a wonderful example because it's really complicated. The experts all know that there are better keyboards. And yet everybody learned on the Qwerty keyboard. And hence, they continue to use it, and they're not motivated to change. A few people are. Just like a few people speak Esperanto, which is a humanly designed language. Most language, by the way, is the epitome of undesigned human action, not human design. Okay? So, yeah, we'll see. This is where it's like, it's difficult because, yeah, you got a lot of good points there. Trevor wants to say something.
Well, the last 2 questions tied into what I was going to ask. I mean, if there is a concern or a fear that we might be losing something of the Constitution of Innovation, I wanted to address this fear that you concluded your remarks by raising, insofar as there might be this exclusivity to this Constitution, and what sort of creative or destructive or perhaps innovative ideas might you turn to so that you sleep at night?
Yeah, well, I do sleep at night, fine. But one of the messages of everybody I read who connects to these themes of the Constitution of Innovation is that the expansion of trade is always a net positive. Widening the circle of people with whom you interact in markets is always positive. Now, that's a very politically charged thing to say in this day and age. But that's certainly a direction that I would push. By the way, one of the people who's going to be here to speak is Doug Irwin, who is the leading historian of trade policy in the United States ever since its beginnings. He's at Dartmouth, and he's widely acknowledged as sort of the person on the history of U.S. trade, and he's also an advocate of free trade, and he'll be here speaking about trade and economic liberty, I believe in January or February. It's on February 11th. There we go. And I don't know where, but he is apparently speaking in Phoenix area somewhere else the day before. That's how we got him. He's like, I'm going to be in February, here in February 10th to speak How about if I speak the next day? So you might look to see where he is. And I also am bringing Lant Pritchett, whose argument is also equally controversial, which is you move people to where they can be more productive than they are. People who move to higher productivity areas become themselves more highly productive. So we're going to have some fun conversations this year, and you'll definitely want to come to many. We're also bringing the leading American scholar of John Maynard Keynes and the literary executor of Hayek together. They're good friends. I'm good friends with both of them, and they're going to discuss Keynes and Hayek on economic liberty. And you're going to discover that they're not that much different. Yeah. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. They can very quickly get to the key disagreements. So it'll be fun. Your question.
Yeah, let's take 2 more questions.
Yeah, I have no idea of time, so you have to shut me down.
First, I'd just like to thank you for your lecture.
Mm-hmm.
From what I gathered, part of your argument was that innovation is largely driven by self-interest, but wouldn't you agree that there also has to be an element of shared morals and values among people in order for that to work, and that it can't just be self-interest?
I think you have to really strongly distinguish between selfishness and self-interest. For example, I spent money to go visit my mother because I have an interest that she do well. Is that selfish? Is there, Joey on Friends would be able to construct a version of selfishness that would account for this. There's a few people in the audience who can understand this reference, and the rest of you would just, but so you could, a strict utilitarian, for a strict utilitarian, everything is self-interest. So they can always, you feel better because your mother feels better, therefore you do this. I think that's just unnecessary. So there are lots of things you do that are for all kinds of interests. Some of them are for other people, some of them are for yourself. All of that counts to me as self-interest. The key question is that in a market transaction, we each have to take the other person's interest in regard. Not that I have to take your interest, because if I take your interest, I just hand you everything, right? So it's not that I take your interest as my interest. In fact, the one thing I can't do in exchange is to take you as the object of my action. But I have to consider your action. Why would a company do this? Why would someone offer you a job? Why would someone do that? You have to take that into account in thinking about exchange. So self-interest is not a bad thing at all. Self-interest is something that's a normal part of everyone's lives. Now, self-interest is, so again, Constitution, the framework that we live in has a lot of shared morals. So there's a lot of shared morality that people in our society have. So we understand, in many cases, how other people are going to behave because of that shared morality. And you kind of get bothered when somebody violates the norms of highway traffic driving or the norms of sidewalk walking or kicks their skateboard up and hits you, and like the bike rider cuts you off, goes onto the walk-only zone, right? Like we have it's not just because it's a rule, there's norms, right? There's shared values. So that's all. I have no problem with what you're saying, but it doesn't somehow make market exchange problematic. It's like the sea in which exchange occurs.
I just have a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So would you say that it has no effect, or that there can be a little difficulty between trade between different cultures?
So a different way of talking about that is examining certain kinds of trades that are affected by different kinds of moral rules and also institutional rules. Okay? So one of the things a lot of people have been doing is studying how cultures that have significantly different moralities end up performing under the same kinds of markets, or different kinds of institutional frameworks, like, say, financial law. Okay? And they end up having very different outcomes. So this kind of study happens all the time. And it's a very interesting study, and I could direct you to lots of resources on various versions of how that study happens. And it's, that's a really good question, because yes, it does have an impact. And some people will say, then we get into this issue of, well, what's the best morality to have, like lots of income? There we're starting to wade into interesting conversations. So you might be surprised.
One last question.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cameron Vega. I'm also a Scuttle student. My question has to do with the future of innovation, and that is that does, at times, market-tested innovation stifle future innovations? With my example being that on a scholarship application in high school, I had a question asking whether or not history and English should still be offered at universities because they don't produce quite the same market value as economics majors, marketing majors, and that the extinction of some of these majors at certain universities is done to increase the rate of hire.
Yeah, I tend to be a fan of tuition rates varying by how valuable the degree is in the marketplace. So instead of charging everybody the same tuition, why should you pay more if you're getting an English degree and are facing a lower market? That's an economist. And it's a really weird economist response. Okay, allow tuition, the price, to vary upon the value that the person's going to get from it. Okay? And there actually are places that do this. They tend to do it on the upside, not the downside. Even in egalitarian Canada, just from, whoops, my Canadian connections, the University of Waterloo's information systems program costs 6 times as much, undergraduate, costs 6 times as much as its humanities programming does. But that's because BlackBerry, Research in Motion, RIM, is at the University of Waterloo, and the computing information systems people get good jobs in the computer industry. And so Waterloo's like, we can rent Seek here, we can charge them more money. So they're not doing it out of some market sense, they're doing it because we can get money from it. But of course, it's a market sense too. But so the argument that the question is there value to university education? The answer is yes. One of the questions you have to ask is the value of the education you're receiving worth the cost? That's the market. Right? Like, I don't drive a Mercedes as much as I would like to. I spent 6 months looking down into the Mercedes passenger car plant in Germany and watching the cars be produced. This is where you would go to get your car, and you could have it then delivered to you anywhere in the world. And it's like, but I've never driven or owned a Mercedes because I can't afford it. So how do we think about that as we think about education moving forward? It's interesting. I don't have an answer, but it's fun questions to start. And my answer as an economist is, let's start talking about options. Which ones do we throw out because we don't believe they should happen? And within the range of the ones that we can consider, let's talk about what effects they have. And let's look at the actual effects they have, as opposed to what we want them to have. So, thank you very much. I appreciate it. My office is not in the Skettle offices. It's over in the Computing Commons on the 4th floor, and I'd be happy to meet and talk with you anytime. Thank you.
Let me just say a few closing words. Thank you, Ron.
Please do.
First of all, let me say that the school places a great deal of value on academic spaces where you can ask questions about value, which is a lot of what we do in all of our courses. So as I mentioned before, there's information outside next to the squishy toys, Washington and Lincoln and the Capitol, about our courses, about our speaker programs, and just a reminder, since Ross was mentioning various speakers, there's a separate sheet out there with the speaker lineup for this center fall and spring. But coming up September 11th, Jonah Goldberg in Skettle's major series on polarization and civil disagreement. The next day, Anthony Gill in the next CSEL speaker event. That's September 12th. September 13th, Anthony Gill speaking again. Then September 17th, Richard Brookhiser speaking for the school's Constitution Day lecture, and then we're off to the races. So all that information is out there. Thank you to all the students and faculty and staff who joined us. See you next time.